My first lesson at the Royal Palace of Madrid was silence. Not the respectful silence of a church, but a heavy, watchful silence, like the air before a storm. My name is Mateo, and I was 12 when my uncle, a minor functionary in the royal household, secured me a position as a page. My duty was to be a ghost in livery, to open doors, carry messages, and fade into the tapestries, my ears deaf and my eyes blind to the affairs of the great. This was in the years after the King's Restoration, the period the books would later call the ominous decade. For us inside the palace, it was simply life. We knew the King Ferdinand VII as the master. We saw the public face, the pious monarch who attended Mass daily, the stern father of the nation who signed decrees with a heavy hand. But even a boy could feel the sickness in the stones. The courtiers moved with the rigid smiles of puppets, their eyes darting about, constantly aware of who was listening. Laughter was rare and brittle. Fear was the true master of the house, and it emanated from the king's private apartments like a pestilence. My specific duties were on the second floor, the corridor that housed the king's private study and a series of receiving rooms. It was a lonely post. One evening, while polishing a gilded mirror in an antechamber, I noticed a strange discrepancy. The ornate scrollwork on the mirror's frame seemed loose. My childish curiosity got the better of my training. With trembling fingers, I worked at a small carved cherub. It didn't move. But the one next to it did. It twisted, and with a soft click, a narrow section of the wall beside the mirror opened, revealing not stone, but a darkness that smelled of dust and secrets. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a place I should not be. But the silence of the corridor pulled me in. I slipped into the passage, pulling the door shut behind me. It was barely wider than my shoulders, a servant's passage, but not for carrying trays. This was a passage for listening. Tiny, almost invisible holes were bored through the walls at eye level, disguised on the other side within the patterns of wallpaper or the deep recesses of a carved wooden panel. I crept to the first one. My eye pressed to the cold plaster. I found myself looking directly into the office of a high-ranking minister. I had stumbled upon the king's secret. I, Mateo, the boy who was meant to see nothing, had found the way to see everything. And in my youthful folly, I thought it was a thrilling adventure. I did not yet understand that I had just stepped into the king's own mind, a dark, cramped, and terrifying place from which there would be no escape. The passages became my secret world. I learned their geography like the back of my own hand, a web of veins running through the heart of the palace, all leading back to the king. I soon discovered I was not their only user. The king himself, a heavy, silent man, would move through them. I learned the sound of his breathing, the soft scuff of his shoes. My terror of being discovered was matched only by my morbid fascination. Through the peepholes, I witnessed the true governance of Spain. It was not done in the Grand Council chambers, but through whispers and blackmail. I saw the king watching a nobleman, his face a mask of sadistic glee as he read a stolen letter that would ruin the man. I saw him listening, as his sycophantic camarilla shared lewd gossip about their rivals, which the king would meticulously note in a small leather-bound book. Competence and honesty were curses. I watched a brilliant general propose a vital military reform, only to be dismissed and later arrested because the king had overheard him making a joke at the prime minister's expense. The king was not a ruler. He was a collector of secrets, a connoisseur of human frailty. His power did not come from his crown, but from the peephole. His obsession was not limited to politics. The passages snaked their way to the private apartments of courtiers, even to the bedchambers of his queen. I once saw him standing for nearly an hour in the dark, his eye pressed to a tiny hole, watching the pious Queen Maria Josepha as she prayed by her bedside. There was no lust in his gaze, only a cold, unsettling curiosity, the look of a scientist studying an insect. It was this detached cruelty that frightened me more than any outburst of anger. He used what he saw to play monstrous games. I witnessed him compliment a courtier on a secret gift he had given his wife, a gift the king could only have known about by spying. The courtier's face went white with terror, understanding in that instant that his entire life was a stage and the king his only audience. Ferdinand would then laugh, a low, guttural sound that never reached his eyes, enjoying the man's quiet agony. I, too, became an unwilling player in his games. One day, as I polished the floors, the king stopped before me. My blood turned to ice. He looked down at me, his face unreadable. "The boy Mateo," he said, his voice soft. "You are a quiet boy. You see much." He then reached out and tapped the wall behind me, the very spot where I knew one of his secret doors was hidden. Loyal eyes are a valuable thing. He smiled a brief, terrifying twitch of his lips, and walked on. It was not a question. It was a command and a threat. He knew. I did not know how, but he knew. My secret adventure was over. I was now part of the architecture of his paranoia. I was no longer a ghost. I was one of the king's eyes. My life became a waking nightmare. The king's acknowledgement of my secret did not grant me favor. It made me his instrument. He would summon me not with a direct order, but with a look, a subtle gesture toward a corridor. I was to go into the passages and watch. Then, a day or a week later, I would be called to his study under the pretense of some menial task. "The Duchess of Alva," he would muse, staring out the window. "She seems troubled today, Mateo. Do you think her husband's business in Cadiz goes poorly?" My heart would pound. I knew he was referencing the tearful letter I had seen the Duchess reading through a peephole 2 nights prior. I was expected to confirm the king's intuition. "She has seemed anxious, Your Majesty," I would stammer, my eyes fixed on the floor. "Anxious," he would repeat, savoring the word. "Yes, we must pray for her husband's success." It was a test. He was calibrating my usefulness, confirming that what he saw through his eyes, his other eyes, my eyes saw as well. I was trapped. To deny seeing anything would be a lie, an act of defiance he would punish. To report what I saw made me a collaborator, a cog in his machine of psychological torture. I lived in a state of perpetual dread, my silence as damning as any confession. The king's cruelty grew more elaborate. His third wife, the gentle Saxon queen, was his frequent target. He knew of her deep piety and her horror of physical intimacy. One of my tasks was to ensure the queen's chambers were always stocked with fresh candles. It was an excuse to be there. The king wanted to know everything: what she read, to whom she spoke, how long she prayed. He seemed to derive a sadistic pleasure from her innocence, circling it like a shark, prodding at her virtue as if it were a personal affront. The worst night of my service came when a young, ambitious nobleman, the Marquis de Soria, was discovered to be having an affair with the wife of a government minister. It was a common enough sin at court, but the Marquis was a known liberal sympathizer. The king saw an opportunity not just for punishment, but for sport. He did not arrest the Marquis. Instead, he hosted a grand ball. At the height of the festivities, the king called for silence and announced a special entertainment, a play, to be performed by members of the court. He handed out scripts he had written himself. The play was a thinly veiled farce depicting the affair, filled with humiliating, intimate details that only a spy could know. He cast the Marquis as the cuckolded husband and his lover as the virtuous, long-suffering wife. He, the king, played the part of the wise monarch who uncovers the truth. I watched it all from a service alcove, my stomach churning. I saw the blood drain from the Marquis's face, the trembling of the minister's wife as she was forced to act out her own humiliation. The court, trapped in the king's game, offered a strained, horrified applause. That night, the Marquis de Soria rode out of Madrid and was never seen again. The king had not killed him, but he had erased him, and he had done it with a smile on his face. He had turned the man's life into a cautionary tale, a piece of theater for his own amusement. As the years passed, the king's body began to fail. Gout twisted his joints, and his heavy frame grew bloated. His paranoia, however, only sharpened. The passages became his refuge, the one place where the ailing tyrant still felt absolute control. His obsession with producing an heir became a mania, a subject of grotesque gossip throughout the court that I was forced to overhear. The failure of his third marriage was a deep, festering wound to his pride, and he blamed the queen's piety. Rather than his own failings, the palace itself seemed to be decaying with him. The tapestries grew faded, the gilding chipped, and a perpetual chill lingered in the corridors. The silence was heavier than ever, broken only by the king's labored breathing from within the walls. He trusted no one. Ministers were dismissed. On a whim, generals were exiled based on a misheard whisper. He saw assassins in every shadow. His only true confidants were the secret reports and the silent, watching eyes he had cultivated, like my own. His fourth wife, the young and clever Maria Cristina, brought a brief, strange light into the gloom. Unlike the others, she was not afraid of him. She seemed to understand his nature, his weaknesses. She managed him with a deftness no one had ever dared. When she finally gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, the palace celebrated. But for the king, it was a partial victory, a fresh source of anxiety. He had an heir, but not a son. This single fact would be the catalyst for his final, most destructive act. I watched him in the passages, observing his new wife and child. His expression was no longer one of cold curiosity, but of a strange, possessive fear. He was a god whose mortality was catching up to him, and he was terrified of what would happen when he was gone. He became obsessed with the loyalty of his brother, Don Carlos, the arch-conservative who stood to inherit the throne if the old laws held. From my hiding places, I saw the final act of his reign unfold, the secret meetings, the arguments with ministers, the immense pressure exerted by the new queen. I watched him, his hands shaking with age and illness, as he signed the pragmatic sanction, the document that would tear the country apart. He was not thinking of Spain. He was thinking only of himself, of thwarting the brother he despised. It was the ultimate act of a selfish, paranoid man, a final move in a game only he was playing, with the fate of millions as the prize. The king died in 1833. The day his death was announced, a strange thing happened in the palace. The silence broke. It was replaced by a frantic, buzzing energy, the sound of factions forming, of courtiers choosing sides, of a kingdom preparing for war. For the first time in years, the air moved. My service was no longer required. In the chaos of the new regency, I was just another piece of old furniture. Mateo, who had held the king's deepest secrets, was dismissed with a small pension and a warning to forget everything I had ever seen or heard. Forget? How could I? I left the palace a young man, but I felt ancient. My soul stooped from years of hiding in the dark. For the rest of my life, I could not enter a room without checking the walls for seams, without feeling the weight of a hidden gaze. The king had hollowed me out, replacing my own thoughts with his secrets. I lived a quiet life in a small village far from Madrid. I watched from a distance as the Carlist Wars, the brutal conflicts the king had personally authored, tore my country apart. Every report of a burned village, every list of the dead, felt like a personal condemnation. I had stood by and watched the monster sharpen his knives. I never spoke of what I saw. To whom could I speak? Who would believe that the great and terrible history of their time was forged in the petty, perverted obsessions of a lonely man, shuffling through the dark passages of his own home? But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moans around the eaves of my cottage, I can still hear it. The soft scuff of his shoes on the floorboards behind the wall. The low, guttural laugh. the silence of a kingdom holding its breath. He is long dead, but for me, the king is never truly gone. I am his last peephole, and my memory is his final haunted palace.